Thank you. Good afternoon, Robin and Jaime and participants in this very important webinar, that is a part of NAGC's efforts, as Dr. Cassiano has already introduced to us. Their efforts to introduce to the community of gifted education professionals, as for some and for others to extend their understanding of the need for us to integrate cultural competency training into the field of gifted education on a broader scale. This session will focus much of its attention on instructional strategies, as the title says. And as we've recommended to you, if you have questions, you can write your questions in the chat box, and I will break at maybe about 20 minutes from now. That'll make it about 5:25 to see those questions and then respond to the questions. And if there are none, I'll try to continue through the presentation. And of course, the accessibility of the presentation and the links on the presentation will be very, very helpful to you, not just today, but as you continue to explore these issues at the local, state, and regional levels, and with classroom teachers in particular, and will make myself available to you to share additional information as needed. I'm very excited about this topic and very pleased to see those who are with us now, and of course for those who may take advantage of this material at a later date. This discussion will explore creating classrooms where all ethnic groups are valued and respected, classrooms that use culture to form the foundation for improved understanding of the contribution of varied groups to society's social and historical progress, and classrooms that integrate the dynamic mix of race, ethnicity, class, gender, religion, and family that contributes to every student's cultural identity. I can't go any further in this conversation today without mentioning the historic vote at the Supreme Court yesterday and the even more historic conversation or dispute given by Justice Sotomayor. I share that with my undergraduate students today, and we know that the ban on race-based admissions is going to cause quite a stir across the country, and the ripple effects will be great. And so again, this topic today for classrooms and educators and families and the students we serve is a great topic. It's a dynamic topic. It's controversial, but it's one that is critically important to our progress as a nation. This next slide is one of many that you might see when we look at the notion of racism being the elephant in the room. I shared this most recently with colleagues during a state meeting, and we had some conversation about what this means to us. Race and racism and topics that are related to race are very challenging for us as educators and difficult to talk about. And because they're difficult, we oftentimes ignore them. We pretend that they don't exist. And sometimes people tend to get a little defensive when we bring up the issue of race and how it relates to what we do in the classroom and how we treat children. And that's why, once again, this issue that we're exploring today around color blindness is so critically important to our progress. This is a good definition of color blindness that was retrieved from a Psychology Today article written by Dr. Williams. And as you can see from the publication date, it's not new. It's at least 3 years old. And so this, again, is an issue that we've been discussing, particularly in the area of psychology and social sciences. But now we're beginning to pay more attention to what is color blindness in our classrooms and how does it demonstrate itself? How does it manifest itself? Well, according to this definition, colorblindness is a racial ideology that suggests that the best way we can end discrimination is by treating individuals across cultures as equally as possible without regard to race, culture, or ethnicity. This psychologist who wrote the article and so many of their colleagues suggest that colorblindness is a form of racism. Why is it a form of racism? Because what colorblindness suggests is that we would negate the appearance of race in any form, that we would negate the importance of appearance. This slide here, and I'll talk a little bit more shortly about the I Too Am Harvard project, but as you can see from the placard that this young lady is holding, she's written a quote that we hear so often from classroom teachers, where they would suggest when someone asks them how do they treat children of different cultural groups, classroom teachers often say, "I don't see color." And then this young lady says, "Does that mean you don't see me?" And so I think it's something that we all have experienced. We've all come across it. We've been involved with conversations about what is this color blindness and why is it an important issue for us to discuss. The next slide talks about color blindness not being a panacea. It is not. It is not a panacea. It is not the perfect image that we would, or the perfect world, or the perfect state we would like for our educators to be in. Expression by educators that I am colorblind, or I see all my students the same, indicates that the culture, experience, and historical legacy of students of color is negated, disregarded, dismissed, and ignored. And that's certainly not something that we would recommend for our classroom teachers in any setting, but particularly in settings with gifted education, gifted learners, because these students are very, very sensitive to the way that individuals are treated, to humane conditions, to social justice issues. They're very, very, very sensitive. And their sensitivity will also challenge classroom teachers when they see that injustice is taking place in a regular classroom or classroom setting. Next, I have a few slides that provide some definitions for important terms that every race-sensitive educator should know. I list here just about six or eight of these terms, but I do have additional materials, and I can share those, and I will perhaps be sharing those with you with an upcoming NAGC publication. But right now, let's take a look at a few of these terms. This is a very familiar term to us, those of us who have had multicultural training, and it's the term is acculturation. So what is acculturation? Acculturation is the process in which members of one cultural group adopt the beliefs, norms, and tradition of another group, therefore negating or leaving behind their own cultural legacy. Code switching is also another term that we as educators need to make ourselves familiar with if we're not already. So what is code switching? Code shifting is the act of shifting or mixing different patterns of speech in conversation, reflexive changes in expression patterns, and kind of hopscotching between different cultural and linguistic spaces and different parts of our own identity. The research that describes culturally diverse learners who have been successful indicate that these learners are quite adept at code switching. As a matter of fact, have created their own types of code switching behaviors so that they can find themselves successful and to be able to adopt and adapt in any setting. That means that they'll change their language, they'll change the way they express themselves, they will change the way that they relate to people from different cultural groups. These young people have found themselves capable of doing so, and those who are more able to code switch will tend to be more successful. So what does that suggest to us? That for those students who have capabilities but are not code switching as well, perhaps there are some things that we can do to help them become more familiar with the strategies and the different patterns of speech that may help them be more successful. Or, as educators, we just have to recognize that because an individual speaks a certain way or dresses a certain way or expresses himself in terms of their culture a certain way does not mean that that person is any less intelligent or less creative or less capable than anyone else. And so this is why the color blindness issue has to come to our attention. We really have to look beyond being colorblind to recognize the differences in the ways that people speak and they carry themselves, and that because of these differences, they have to be seen, they have to be recognized in order for us to do the best job that we can possibly do with all these different students. The included in this definition is an excellent blog that appears on the NPR website, and I would certainly highly recommend that as an excellent extra resource that you go to that website to check out what NPR has to say about code switching. The cultural mismatch theory was derived from the work of a Hispanic educator back in the late 1990s. This person described code switching as the variance or difference between values, norms, and traditions of teachers or other authoritative figure and students or any other subservient group. This variance causes, therefore, a mismatch. So when teachers are one cultural group, come from one cultural experience, and their students are from a different cultural experience, it makes for a difficult challenge in the classroom for both the students and the teachers. And so there are many recommendations in theory and practice as to how we can get our teachers to become more culturally aware. And cultural competency training is one of the greatest recommendations we can make to any school district. But until that training takes place, be aware that cultural difference between teachers and students makes the difference between how well they're going to relate and how well, in many cases, those students are going to perform, whether they've been identified as gifted or not. Of course, we understand what disproportionality is. It's a term that we've heard often when we are making reference to the overrepresentation or underrepresentation of a particular group within a group or a system. This condition creates disparities and inequities that cannot be corrected or remedied until recognition of the underlying cause is addressed. Once again, we have to recognize these causes in order for us to make a difference. It's just like with race in the room. If we are not familiar and we are not willing to recognize the cause of race and racism as a problem for our schools and our institutions, then we'll never be able to address the issues of race and racism. Microaggressions comes out of the work of a number of social scientists, and one of the, I think the more popular social scientists will be Dr. Daryl Sue, and this blog at Psychology Today also gives a very fine definition and gives you some references, some additional references for Sue's work there. What is a microaggression? It's a brief and everyday slight, insults, indignities, and denigrating messages sent to people by sometimes well-intentioned white people who are unaware of the hidden messages being communicated. In classrooms every day, everywhere, all across the country, we have witnessed to teachers and other individuals making everyday slights, insults, and indignities and denigrating messages. Now, this is what I want to point you back to, the I Too Am Harvard project. And so when you have an opportunity, if you would just actually search for that project and find the project itself, because what they've done is it was created by a group of students. It's a photo campaign, actually, by a group of black students and students who are in classes with the black students that provides written statements that express the experiences that they've had because they happen to be black or Hispanic or because they happen to be different. Those everyday insults and slights, for example, the one we saw earlier where the young lady said, where the placard says, "I don't see color," and does that mean you don't see me? So for that particular person, the color blindness expression is an insult. Again, being colorblind is not a panacea. I'm going to move through the slides a little bit more quickly now so we can make sure we have ample time to discuss some of the challenges. And we're at 5:19. I don't see any questions just yet. So I think we'll just continue to move through. I want to review for us next some of the challenges that are faced by culturally diverse students in classrooms across the nation. Now, these challenges come from the research that we have, the research that has been provided by scholars who have examined classroom conditions, who have had conversations with these students, with their families. And we know that these conditions continue, they persist in classrooms. So what are the conditions? These students are troubled daily by classroom conditions that set low expectations for them, by classroom teachers, as we mentioned earlier, who have limited cultural understandings, and therefore they are not able to access high-end curriculum and specialized programs as easily as other students simply because of their cultural background. These students are also faced oftentimes with school counselors who do not fairly and equitably advise and guide them into those high-level experiences that they need in order to be fully prepared for higher education. These students have challenges fitting in, feeling as if they're denying their cultural legacy, retaining services, feeling isolated oftentimes. When we include one or two students in a program where the majority culture would be students who are Anglo-American, and we bring in one or two Hispanic or one or two African-American students, those students have expressed in the research that they feel isolated, oftentimes don't feel welcome. Microaggressions kind of exerted at them on a daily basis. Are you sure you belong here? Is this the right place for you? Do you fit? Are you sure you're prepared for this high-level curriculum? So it's not always just that they're being affronted by their peers, but oftentimes even by the adults in the environment. So their sense of belonging is not what it ought to be. These students, of course, as I mentioned, being the only one in the group is challenging for them. And then, of course, their lack of exposure and consistent exposure, I might add, to enriching opportunities early and consistently. And one of the challenges that they have that oftentimes we don't always want to face is that these young people are challenged by general society that portrays diverse youth as aberrant, destined to fail and disrupt instead of succeed and contribute. So the vision that they see of themselves through the media, through conversations among professionals, when they overhear, what is it that people are saying about African American, Hispanic, and children from other cultural groups, immigrant children? What are people saying about these students that helps them to understand that perhaps I'm not the person that I want to be because there's others who think differently of me than I do of myself. So how then do we help link culturally responsive pedagogy to retaining students, to retaining these students and helping them be successful in gifted and advanced learner programs? There is a great need to identify effective ways to prepare teachers who will implement culturally responsive practices that will engage and motivate these children, encouraging the children to affirm their cultural identity in a positive manner. An equally important need is to identify effective ways to alter the attitudes of teachers so that they are willing to reflect upon and change as appropriate their long-held views about teaching, culture, and learning. Critically important is multicultural training or cultural competency training for all teachers, whether they are working with regular education students, special education students, but in this case, as we're discussing, gifted students or advanced students. Without that kind of training, teachers will never be able to extend themselves and be able to share the curriculum in the way that would be most appropriate for the culturally diverse student in the classroom. These students are not having good experiences. We're seeing We're seeing stories. The media is sharing stories with us from these students. The I Too Am Harvard project is an example of a story set where students themselves have expressed deep concern about being in a high-end learning environment but not being comfortable in their skin because they happen to be brown or black, or because they may happen to be biracial, and others are looking at them as if they don't belong. And so it's truly a challenge, and so educators need to alter their attitudes in order to work with these bright students of color on a daily basis. I'm going to skip through this slide and kind of get back to that later. We do have some research, and this is a compilation of research that I put together a couple of years ago, where I looked at culturally diverse gifted learners and looked at what were their strengths. Now, after this slide, I'm going to share with you not just their strengths, but also how do we match with their strengths best practices as we know them to be, or evidence-based practice as we know them to be in gifted education. And so some of the models that you hear about are those that you are quite familiar with. I want to stop, though, before we go any further to find out if there are any questions that the audience might want to ask about some of the earlier materials that I shared.
Joy?
Yes.
In the chat box, there is a very interesting question that from Jacqueline Medina.
Yes.
She asks, what are the steps a teacher would take or could take to see the color and strengths of the child and family to build partnerships in learning with high expectations?
So what are the steps that a teacher would take? First of all, any teacher who recognizes that something has to be done differently is on the right path. I want to say that first off, because too often teachers don't even recognize that something is wrong, or other than someone telling them that something is wrong with the environment. So with the steps that have to be taken, I would certainly recommend that teachers engage with a group in terms of having conversations about what are the problems and what are the concerns that we have. So we have to have these kind of open, non-defensive conversations about race and about culture. We have to recognize our own culture, and in those types of settings we have to recognize our own culture. But this is where this cultural competency training, and it's not something we can do in an hour. It's not something that you can do in a one-day session. Dr. Castellano and I have both been engaged in training sessions, and we know that it takes longer, because we're talking here about changing attitudes that are lifelong attitudes that have been embedded in an individual's psyche that they came through as they were growing up. And so they go into a new environment and they're faced with these challenges, and it's not something that you can have them read materials or go into a one-day session and suggest that we're going to be over this, overnight. So certainly constructed cultural competency training along with non-defensive conversations about race. So someone can mediate a conversation with the adults about race. Now, then what do we do to build these relationships with parents and family members? We want to make sure that we have opportunities for them to come to the table and discuss with us what their families are like, give their family strengths, invite them to come in and share stories about their family, about their culture. Then these families will feel more comfortable talking with schools when schools ask them to tell us about yourself. Tell us about your experiences. Tell us what your experience can bring to our community of learners that will help enhance us. So the families are not always feeling as if everything they receive, the school has to give it to them, that they also have something to offer to the school. Researchers who do work with families consider families what we call cultural conduits. They are the persons who know the culture better than anyone, better than any researcher, any scholar. And so I think we miss out on a lot when we're not bringing these families in on a regular basis to have conversations with educators. Some informal meetings and then perhaps some formal meetings that should be set up. But I hope I didn't go too far with that. But I do believe that that non-defensive conversations among faculty, among teachers, with someone there to mediate the conversation about racial issues. And then, of course, as I said, formalized training that may take longer than just a one-day session, something a little bit more intense with people who actually do this cultural competency training all the time. And it can be separate and apart from what we do in gifted education, but it can be combined and integrated together. I hope that helps a little bit, Jacqueline.
Are you Stephen? Stephen would like some clarification. He asks, could you address, please, the problem of cultural mismatch arising between students with one set of experiences and a teacher from that same community and who has the same kind of experience, but who received their teacher training at a mainstream college?
Okay, excellent question. And you know what happens, and when we talk about culture, you want to make sure we understand that we're not talking about race in that case, okay? Because I have seen, and perhaps Stephen has seen this himself, I have seen in some settings, I have seen African-American teachers who grew up in a particular community go off to a mainstream college or to a predominantly white institution and to be educated for 4 to 6 years, come back into their community to teach, but they no longer live there. So their cultural, they have been acculturated, or they have changed in their own traditions and their norms, and some of them have forgotten perhaps what it was like to grow up in a particular neighborhood. And then, for example, they were to go back into a community which would be a predominantly low-income community with a lot of challenges within the community itself, and to go in to try to teach students who look like them, physically look like them, but whose cultural experience is very different from theirs. That's cultural mismatch as well. And so for that person, until they've had opportunities to visit in the home, to go to activities outside of school with their students, and again, bring the families into the school, but many times just structured activities where the school personnel are required to go out into the community, go into the churches, go to community activities where they get a better sense for who the students really are, because the student who walks in the school door is a different person oftentimes than the one who was staying in the neighborhood on the block just a few hours earlier. And so what we want for educators is to get a sense for who these students really are and what their experience is. What is poverty doing for these to these particular children? What is violence doing to these particular children? What does it mean for them to be in a homogeneous setting where all of the persons in the community are the same racial group, and then come into an environment in the school where it's a heterogeneous setting. So how does that change the experience for those students? And so without teachers, and of course the burden is on teachers at this point to go into the community to find out more, as opposed to the burden being on the student to change. Because that's what I think the expectation has been often, for students to change who they are in coming into the environment where they're young and they're developmentally not ready to change. So oftentimes we really would recommend, and in the best cases we've seen where the educators have gone out into the community and they've had a different experience with students because they've come to know them at a different level. And so, yes, that is a tip that is, when we talk again, and I don't mean to repeat myself, but it's very important for us to understand cultural mismatch does not mean racial mismatch. It doesn't mean that the person would always be a middle-class white teacher facing a group of Hispanic and African-American students. It could very well be an African-American or Hispanic teacher who now is living in a middle to upper-income environment and has become acculturated, and they are working with these same types of children but don't have the same sensitivities that perhaps they would have had they remained in that community. Does that help a little bit? I hope it does, Stephen.
Thank you, Joy. That does it for the queries that were in the chat box. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. I want to move on through. I hope you've had a moment to look at this shared strengths listing of the culturally diverse gifted learners. Now, I compiled this list again from out of the work of a number of scholars over the years that have worked with these students and recorded what their strengths are, their traits. The high verbal ability, even if they're not always performing well on reading achievement tests, they do have a great deal of fluency and elaboration that's expressed through their writing. These are students who are more situational, pragmatic problem solvers. They demonstrate, as I've always referred back to Robert Sternberg's, what he calls practical intelligence. They have street smarts, relational smarts. If the material, the instruction relates to their daily experience, you'll begin to see sparks in these students you may not see if what they're being taught and being exposed to has nothing to do with the way they live and nothing to do with what they believe their futures might be. They do have visual spatial strengths. We've seen that demonstrated. We've seen it in the research. The visually spatially gifted student has not received the same amount of attention, however, as the academically gifted student has received, and we're beginning to see more work along those lines. I believe Stephen is doing some great work out in the southwestern part of the country in this area. These students do flourish in hands-on learning environments. They're more energetic. They're more vervistic. The term verve came out of the work of professors at Howard University some years ago, where he talked about these students being very lively. These classrooms, we would anticipate being classrooms where there's a lot going on, simultaneously. The students are allowed to express themselves, and sometimes these classes are going to be noisier than typical academic environments might be. There's a preference, however, because of the cultural groups, for the group or familiar environments over individual learning situations. And now I'm going to just kind of talk through how we might connect their strengths to particular rigorous, relevant instruction that we know in the field of gifted education have been successful, best practices, evidence-based practices. For those students with verbal and linguistic strengths, it just stands to reason that we would engage them in literary analysis. We would have them involved in forensics and debate opportunities. We would integrate music with other content areas, the core contents of science. Of course, the relationship between music and mathematics just we have ample research to suggest that those students who are interested in music tend to be students who are also very interested and very proficient in mathematics. So we want to focus there with these students on writing and using their oral cultural strengths. They come from cultures that are oral cultures, historically oral cultures. Visual spatial strengths, we want to focus attention on STEM, innovative technologies, and even utilizing board games to teach strategic thinking skills. And I'll share some ideas and some materials that we've used, that I've used actually, and others have used in classrooms with these students from diverse backgrounds. These students also, as we said earlier, flourish in hands-on learning environments. And so laboratory classrooms, we use those. We oftentimes have these experiences for gifted learners in general. Then we want to make sure these students have the same kinds of opportunities. They do also have a facility and ease with use of multiple modalities. So again, multiple modalities in classrooms are very, very important to engage them, to keep them interested, to also help them understand the relationships between content and between disciplines. Their verve, their energy, it's just, when you see these students working in an exciting learning experience, you see learning taking place, but you also see them engaging in ways that we want all children to be excited about what they're learning and be able to express what the learning experience is and what it's done for them. The one model that I would always recommend for middle and high school students in particular is to utilize problem-based learning to engage students across content areas because these learners are the ones, again, who are situational, pragmatic, and relational in their problem-solving capabilities. And I'll share a PBL problem that I came across that I thought was a really great one that also connects with the culture of the students. So here are a few, we're going to wrap up with a few culture-sensitive instructional ideas. And now I would dare say once again that there are numerous ideas. There's lots of material. I think sometimes teachers have to locate the material, and I think perhaps that's where we, as the NAGC, can come in. We'll begin looking at ways that we can package up some of this material and these ideas so that teachers will have easier access as they begin identifying more culturally diverse students. How can we provide resources for you as an organization? And so that's one of the things that we're doing. The toolkit that's being developed also is along the same line. But just a few ideas here I want to share with you. When you're teaching literary analysis or using bibliotherapy, from a thematic approach, using a thematic approach, there are a number of mirror books that I could certainly recommend, and I've listed a few of them here. And then the suggested level, whether it's pre-adolescent, adolescent, or up to young adult. For example, if the theme would be surviving against the odds and cultural identity, I would absolutely recommend The House on Mango Street by Cisneros. That's a powerful a piece of literature. It has many, many themes embedded in the book, and it does. It begins. I think you could use it at the pre-adolescent level, but I also think that Cisneros' piece is deep enough and complex enough that we could use it up through high school. Oftentimes I think we don't value the work of the culturally diverse writers as much as we should, but when we begin this process of analyzing literature, we'll see that there are a number. These are just a few examples. I do know of individuals who have a list of books that could be used for this purpose. I actually have an annotated list of books for adolescents, for high schoolers, and for college undergraduate students. That's a book review list that I created on my own. So there are a number of these types of books that we can use when we're teaching literary analysis or bibliotherapy. In the teaching culture, history, and science through PBL, this is a great PBL lesson plan. We know the model for PBL. It's an ill-structured problem. The title of this lesson is Do the Dry Bones Speak? And, of course, this gives you, some of the problems that exist. This is a problem about an archaeological dig in the late 1990s that unearths what remains of what appeared to be the remains of Africans buried in a particular lot in New York City. And so then the problem goes on, and the task for the students is to create a plan for how this discovery can successfully be dealt with to the satisfaction of all parties. I retrieved this from Buffalo University website. The young man that created it, I believe he created this as a part of his dissertation. But again, it's a PBL model, something that we're all familiar with. And of course, as educators, we can be very creative and develop these types of plans and models for ourselves. This is a lesson plan, one that I developed for the use of literature, and actually two poems by authors that students may or may not be familiar with. But again, any artist or leader, any works could be listed there. Okay, and I want to skip through to try to get us through to these poems. The poems themselves are here. This is a more contemporary poem, and then this one takes us back to the mid-1990s. This is this area. Am I still? Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I want to talk a little bit about ethnomathematics, and then I think we'll wrap, and if there are any questions at the end. This is a field of study that I believe a lot of people have either overlooked or don't have any awareness of at all. Ethnomathematics was introduced by a Brazilian educator and mathematician in the late 1990s. This individual is a mathematician, but also has a great interest in social justice issues. And in a monograph that was published in 2007, he describes the ethnomathematics theme and what it means. But the goal of it is to acknowledge cultural systems and frameworks through mathematics that have existed since the beginning of time. And just maybe 2 years ago, I came across a young man's TED Talk that was reflective of the ethnomathematics theme. And this young gentleman, this Dr. Ron Iglash, teaches fractals through the use of African architecture, art, hair braiding, all based on fractal designs. And I just thought this was powerful. So again, these are ideas, concepts that we will be teaching in classes with gifted students anyway, so why not bring in the cultural ideas, the cultural history along with this? And so if this is a mathematician, a math instructor, they would be very interested in taking a look at Ron Iglash's TED Talk and then the subsequent work that follows. So he's gone into other universities, he's done workshops on these ideas, and the TED Talk itself is extremely exciting while as he's talking and teaching about what he discovered as he traveled into Africa, as he looked at the homes, the design of certain homes in the villages, the art there, the hair braiding that in itself was a mathematical puzzle, but a mathematical design that I think oftentimes we're not paying as much attention to as we perhaps we can, bringing value to the culture itself. And then I want to wrap with a few strategy games across cultures. And again, once again, more resources for teachers to kind of take a look at the history of different cultural groups and how cultural groups have designed games of strategy since almost the beginning of time. Many of you may already be familiar with Mancala or the Wari game. You may have heard it called Wari. It is the oldest known ancient strategy game in Africa and perhaps of the world. It usually involves 2 rows and 6 holes, or either 4 rows and 8 holes. It challenges players to gather stones, more stones than their opponent. A report from the Smithsonian Institute, and we believe this validates the use and the importance of Mancala, described it as the national game of the continent of Africa. In a 10 most important board games, I found 3 other board games that would be of great interest to students, and it also helps us give some history of how some of the games that are more familiar to our populations today were originated and where the ideas came from. But it's just there's so many ideas on the market, ideas that I believe we can make so much better use of if we can share these models across groups with one another, take a look at the replication of ideas that go from culture to culture. Finally, I want to suggest that any comprehensive model for culturally diverse gifted learners must include active engagement of families, identifying students as cohort groups, offering a range of options in STEM, arts, leadership, ensuring that teachers and staff are culturally competent. Again, if we are going to do the best we can by these learners and the best we can by all gifted learners, cultural competency is critical. Mentoring, providing role models of similar cultures and genders. These students need to see themselves as adults today. And so the way to do that is through good mentoring programs. And, of course, finally, to integrate cultural traditions, norms, and history into content area instruction. It can be done on a daily basis. It's important for all children, not just those who are traditionally considered culturally diverse. All learners need to know the value and the importance of culture and the various cultures that represent who we are as Americans today. I have some time for questions, and I'm glad to try to answer anyone's question if I can at this point. Are there any questions that have come about or that you've come up with over the last 20 minutes?
Joy, there is one from Sue in the chat box that she would like you to expand on if possible. And
Sure.
The question is, can you speak more to the strength of preference for group and familial learning over individual learning situations? In other words, a preference to learning in groups rather than by yourself.
Right. Well, for what we know, Sue, about many culturally diverse populations, and I want to, this is the indigenous population, or the population as they have developed within their own cultural groups, the African American family groups, Hispanic family groups, other family groups that have come into our nation from other nations. These individuals have, and the research has shown us that these are familial group orientations. Familial group meaning the family unit itself is the most important unit in non-Western cultures. The family unit is the most important unit. And so even today in contemporary times, these students in schooling settings would much prefer, we see the preference for working in groups. And actually, when the cooperative learning movement came about in this country some years ago, cooperative learning, one of the reasons that it happened was to help students learn how to work together, as disparate groups. But we also understood that to be the familial group environment to be a preference for students of color. It was a preference, whereas students who are more Western-oriented have a preference for individual work and more for competition, whereas these others have more of a preference for cooperation. And so if we want to utilize their cultural norm in the classroom setting, more opportunities to work in group settings, to work together as a group. The competitive nature of all human beings may rise to the surface eventually anyway, but to bring them together in groups and allow them to work out problems in groups and work through new understandings of concepts in a group setting is something that's more natural, where you will find the students to be more inclined in that direction as opposed to just everything that goes on in school being individual in nature. Does that help a little bit?
I'm sure it does.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, Joy. There's another question in the chat box that is reflective of the conversation and the time you spent speaking to practical intelligence. And Jacqueline was hoping if you can maybe expand the conversation a little more, and if possible, identify any resources that you may have that would describe indicators of what practical intelligence is.
Okay, I wanted to. I have resources, but I have to. I will see if I can do a search while I'm on here. Okay, but and I think that's a good idea. What if we're familiar, and I like to take this back to Bob Sternberg's work. Of many of the scholars in the field of gifted education or intelligence education who has given us ideas about how people can be smart, I always go back to his work because and of course people have taken Sternberg's work and done all kinds of things with it now. But practical intelligence can mean the difference between an individual's success or failure. Practical intelligence in common language means somebody who is wise or who has common sense. So many of these students will come to us while they may be have deficiencies in content strength. They may have strengths that that can speak to them being wiser or being smarter when it comes to everyday knowledge, or relative, being able to relate what goes on in the classroom setting to what goes on in the real world. So the practical intelligence. My first reference would be to Robert Sternberg's work. But again, there's a number of people out whose work could also take us in that direction. But I would certainly go to Sternberg's definition of what practical intelligence is. You know, later he went on to start describing what he saw as wisdom. And even in identifying these young children, when we create identification checklists for parents and ex-parents, what do you think about this child? I've heard African American parents and even Hispanic parents who have suggested that these children were wiser than their age. They knew more than they should know for their age. And so, you know, that also relates itself back to this whole notion of wisdom and practical intelligence. But I would certainly point to his work and to look at some of the work by psychologists that deal with intelligence. So that's one. Let's see if I can. I'm just looking to see if there's some resources or some references. There's so many theories of intelligence and overview. Yeah, here's just a real quick piece here.
Sure.
Mm-hmm. So there are lots of ideas and resources, and I want to share, and I hope that Robin doesn't mind my sharing this, but out of this work that I'm doing, and hopefully others will join me in this at some point, we will be creating select books for NAGC, so that along with the select book, there will come numerous resources and ideas that will tie into this brief presentation. This is a 1-hour presentation with just a few slides, but this few slides will be extended to become a book in which we'll provide, you know, many more resources. Okay, I hope that helps. It may not help immediately, but it won't be too long before this will all become a select book published by NAGC.
Joy, there is a high level of interest in the annotated book list you referenced under mirror books or bibliotherapy, and many of the participants were wondering about access to those annotated lists.
Okay, I have one list that I created for undergraduate students, but I do think that the list is very relevant for high school students as well. And that will be a part of something that I can share. But if anybody emails me, I don't mind sending it to you at this point, because it's like about 3 pages long, and it'll give you the title of the book. It'll give the themes. It provides a brief annotation. The annotation will maybe 3 to 4 sentences long. The author and it was utilized for a course in diversity education. Okay. So if you email me at, I think my email address should be at the end of this. Yes. Actually, you can send it to this email address, or if you want to just go jdavis@vuu.edu, or this Gmail address is perfectly fine. And in the subject box, write book list, and I'll remember what it is. Okay. Yeah. Okay, Jacqueline. I see your message. Yeah. We'll love to annotate a list. I'll be glad to send that, because that's already created. Now, there are group lists that I've seen. I just ran across a wonderful list of 50 books by Latino authors. I'm just like, wow, that was great, because I hadn't seen that many together. I know that the books are out there, but I had not seen that many together. Now, this list, however, is not categorized by grade level, but it is a very comprehensive list. I have a link to that. That's on a website called Mamiverse, MAMIVERSE, but I can send that to you. Again, I didn't create that list, but I saw it. I looked at the books, and some of the books I was very familiar with, not all of them, but it's a great list. I also have a colleague who has created an annotated book list that covers multiple cultures, and she gave me access to that to use when I was writing my book, and I'm sure she won't mind if I push that out there too. So her name is Jane Gagne. Ganji, G-A-N-G-I. Jane is her first name. She was in Eastern Connecticut. I'm not sure where she's working at now, but Jane has done a great deal of work around multicultural literacy. And I think she's someone whose work we would all appreciate. I certainly appreciate her.
Joy, we have about a minute left. Any final words of wisdom on the topic?
Well, I just want to make it clear that that the issue of race and culture in schools is present and before us, and it's critically important that we address it, and we could only address it when we recognize the importance of it. We recognize the importance of the multiple cultures who are part of our schools, who are part of our communities, and we recognize and value, not tolerate. Tolerance is not a very nice word, but value everyone for what they bring to the environment. Everyone has a culture. Everyone's culture is important, and students need to feel that we accept them for who they are, and then we will help them to develop their intelligence by providing them access and opportunity. I really am critically concerned about school settings that overlook or ignore the importance of race and culture. We will not be successful if we continue to do this, but if we are willing and able and open and brave enough, sometimes it just takes some courage to face race and face culture and gifted education, we will have great success in the long term. Thank you all so much for listening.
Please join me in thanking Joy for sharing her time and expertise with our members today. Please take a moment to fill out the online evaluation located in the links box. We value your feedback and hope to see you back online next week. Again, thank you for participating in today's webinar.